Buenos dias. Hello and welcome back to Foster Learning, where it's another beautiful rainy afternoon in beautiful Cabo Rojo, Puerto Rico. Damaris and I live off the grid, which means we have no water except when it rains. We collect it, and we're not connected to any sort of electricity. We have a few solar things. So for us, this rain is just awesome because this is the water that we use. Well, today we're going to introduce the first course within the series, If I Can Learn Math, You Can Learn Math, that we talked about in the previous video or introduction. So as I mentioned previously in the last video, that the first mathematics course that we are going to work through together is essentially Precalculus, and that name is somewhat artificial. The topics involved are much more important than just getting you ready to do calculus, but they are very important so that we can do calculus, which of course is very fundamental in mathematics and physics and all sorts of things. So essentially, Precalculus, or this course, can be thought of as consisting of two kind of particular branches of mathematics or subjects. One being algebra and one being trigonometry. Those two together in their own right are of course very important for not just calculus, all sorts of other things in math, and just within themselves they're very important and very interesting topics, but they are necessary tools to be able to work with calculus, to work with the calculus. So that's kind of where we're building up to. So this course, Precalculus, will essentially consist of algebra and trigonometry. I'll explain how we're going to kind of divide that up and work through it in just a minute. But before we jump into that, we're going to take some time to review or perhaps be introduced to some fundamental and basic concepts that will be necessary to work through the algebra and the trigonometry, to work through the Precalculus. We'll spend our first series of video lessons on that. There's quite a wide variety. I'll introduce those when we get to them. But if you're feeling a little bit like, well, it's been a while since I've had algebra or trigonometry, or I've never had them, don't worry. I understand. I was in the same boat. And again, part of the way we're tailoring our courses, we're expecting that most people are at least going to be a little bit fuzzy on some of the prerequisite type stuff and possibly have never been exposed to them before. Or if they had, if you were like me, it was a long time ago and a time when you really couldn't have perhaps cared less. So we're going to take some necessary time to review or be introduced to some basic fundamentals and concepts that will help us work through the algebra and trigonometry. Once we get through those, then I'm going to attempt to provide videos kind of in parallel, both with the algebra side and the trigonometric side. And the reason for that is multiple. One is that depending on what high school or what college you're in, people structure these somewhat differently. Some courses, it's just simply a pre-calculus course, and you kind of work through some algebra stuff. Then when you get to the trigonometric functions, you kind of work through trigonometry, and then you kind of continue on to some other stuff. Others, it's kind of it is two separate courses. There's algebra, and then there's trigonometry, and then there may be as another kind of a pre-calc course that introduces some other type of items into your repertoire to be able to then go and do calculus. So many of you may be more interested in the algebra side or more interested in the trigonometry side, and I don't want you to have to wait until we kind of work through systematically when we can kind of do them in parallel. These fundamentals will be essential to get out of the way before we do either of them. So we'll be sticking to those, and when we get done with those, then we'll be kind of building on our algebra side and our trigonometry side in parallel, hopefully, if all goes well, so you can, depending on where you're at, it'll be easier to pick up on. Okay, some of the broad topics that we'll be discussing in this course, Precalculus, we'll be looking at equations and inequalities, functions and graphs. These functions they'll kind of dominate our conversation for much of this. We'll be looking at some specific types of functions. We'll be looking at some polynomial and rationals, inverse, exponential, and logarithmic, and of course trigonometric functions. And this is where, if you are working through this kind of linearly, this is where you take quite some time and look at trigonometry as a whole. I'll talk a lot more about some of the kind of subtopics that we'll be dealing with in trigonometry once we get through these basics. Okay, and then we'll also be looking at systems and matrices, a little bit of analytic geometry, just namely the conic sections. We'll be looking at some polar coordinates, vectors, and even some sequences and series. Now, that may seem like a little bit, but each one of these we're going to cover a lot of material. This is going to be fairly time extensive. These are foundational. They're really necessary for us to be able to be successful in calculus or whatever else we do. With that said, I don't want you to think that the only goal of this is to get you ready for calculus, however. Algebra and trigonometry, both individually, are incredibly interesting, incredibly important, and entire courses are devoted to each of those. Algebra in particular is very fundamental to not just calculus, but a lot of mathematics and how we do mathematics. I kind of liken algebra to ball handling in basketball. When I was growing up, my dad would tell us kids who are all trying to make it in sports to, if you want to be good basketball players, we have to be free with the ball. So he'd say, go to this dark room and just dribble, just practice, just dribble, and then you will be free with the ball. Well, that sounded fun, but it wasn't the funnest drill to do, so I think I did it twice, and consequently I didn't have a very good basketball career because I was lacking that fundamental. I was never free with it. Well, algebra is kind of similar to form this analog with mathematics, at least from my perspective. Algebra is so fundamental that if you're free with algebra, it makes everything beyond, or at least a lot beyond, a lot more manageable, make a lot more sense. In fact, when I went back to school for math, if you watched the previous video, you heard a little bit of my mathematical story. I spent most of my time, and I had the most difficulties, not with the new concepts I was introduced to, whether it be calculus or differential equations or etc., but it was with the algebra that I should have learned back in high school. Now, it had been a long time since I was in high school, but I also didn't pay attention in high school. So for me, my college experience was dominated not by the new concepts of the so-called higher math, but with the algebra, the foundation, the fundamentals that I really should have learned in high school. So I'm hoping that we can build a good solid foundation for anything that we go beyond, but even if this is really our only interest, algebra and trigonometry both in different ways are incredibly interesting, very practical in some ways, and very necessary, and they're very basic and foundational to anything we really want to do past this. So this is a very important course. It's going to be fairly long. It's going to be fairly involved. We're going to be talking a lot about quite a variety of different things. But they're all very necessary. They're all very exciting, I think. And next lesson, we actually get to dig into the mathematics as we will begin to look at some of these fundamental basic concepts. Before we depart ways until then, I also want to take this time to suggest or give you a homework assignment. If you want to make the most out of this course, again, this course is designed to supplement one you may be in or to be its own kind of standalone. If this is a standalone, I would encourage you to find a way to get additional problems to the ones that we work through. Working through problems in mathematics in particular, at least for me, is where much of the learning took place. You can go through kind of the concept on the board, and that's great, but as you work through different problems, you see different scenarios, and you really have a chance to explore what doesn't work, and then eventually what does work. And to me, that's where a lot of the theory clicks and it makes sense. So good places to do that. There's all sorts of places on the internet. You'll see each day kind of what we're working through. But also if you can pick up a used textbook, and I won't recommend any particular brand or particular book, but any pre-calc or any algebra type book or any trigonometry book, there'll be applicable sections to whatever we're going through where you can work on some additional problems. And that reminds me as well that this is intentionally structured to somewhat follow generally kind of the way these type of courses or these type of textbooks are generally written or presented. Now there's definitely variance, and I've used my own liberty in times to kind of rearrange things as I think will fit our particular course better. But I want to make this as easy as possible to integrate either into your course that you're supplementing with this, or to make it easy for you to supplement this with something else like a textbook or some other resource. Let's see, what else? Oh yeah, one more thing. Regarding the algebra, let's clarify a little bit what we're going to be dealing with that. This will essentially be what's often deemed college algebra. Now let's not get scared. That doesn't mean algebra that you learn in college. Rather, that's about all the algebraic techniques and fundamentals that you should be familiar with by the time you're ready to start some undergrad college. So essentially all of high school algebra. We won't break it down kind of into Algebra 1, Algebra 2, or however different schools do that. We're going to take it all as kind of one algebra block, but what we're not going to be looking at is what's known as abstract or modern algebra. If you're familiar with that, that's not what we're going to be doing in this course. Perhaps later down the road, I think that would be an interesting course to entertain, but not right now. This is more the algebra that's dominated by functions that we're familiar with from high school or the first few years of college. I think that's it. I look forward to seeing you as we actually get into the mathematics. Next video. I hope you're excited. We'll see you then.